Hey there. Hi, it's me, Kathleen. Thanks so much for listening to Crime Story. And we are so excited for you to hear what we have for you in store in season 3. But I have a small favor to ask. In this episode's description, you'll see a short audience survey. It's designed to help us learn more about you, what you like, what you want to hear more of, any feedback that you have. You'll find the link in our episode descriptions all month long. And if you haven't hit that follow button on whatever podcast app you're listening to us on, can you please go do it? It really helps a lot. Okay, now on to the show.
Heather and Gail took over 4 grey plates to the dinner table, and Erin took her own plate over, and that was said to be a different colour, like a tanny orange colour. And that different plate was how she distinguished her non-lethal meal from her guests.
On a quiet Saturday afternoon in July of 2023, in a small Australian town, a lunch party is had. Beef Wellington is served. Days later, 3 of the guests were dead, another in hospital fighting for his life. The weapon of choice? Death cap mushrooms, one of the world's deadliest fungi. It took police little time to narrow in on the person who had made the meal, a woman named Erin Patterson. What followed was a story that gripped a nation. A wife and mother charged with murder. A courtroom filled with forensic experts, family secrets, and strange details that raised more questions than answers. And at the heart of it, a family trying to make sense of the unimaginable. I spoke with Rachael Brown, one of the journalists who's been doing in-depth coverage on this case for the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. I'm Kathleen Goldhar, and this is Crime Story. So this isn't a typical crime scene, is it? Can you sort of paint the picture where the Beef Wellington is the murder weapon?
Yeah, it's not. You're right. And I think this is what grabbed not only Australia's attention, but the world's. You know, we had people writing in from India, from Paris. We had people on the Camino Trail and the Larapinta Trail, like pilgrimages. And I used to think, why are you listening to a true crime podcast? Just do your pilgrimage. But it just captured the world's attention because of what you just said, because it was the banality of it. You know, it was supposed to be a wholesome family lunch on a Saturday.
So tell me, who was at the lunch? Erin Patterson was the one who made it. I know it's at her house, but who has she got for lunch that day?
That's right. So she had her mother and father-in-law. She was estranged from her husband, Simon Patterson. So his parents were there, Don and Gail Patterson. And then Ian Wilkinson, pastor at the local church, and Ian's wife, Gail Wilkinson. And Gail and Heather were sisters.
So her mother-in-law, her former mother-in-law, and her mother-in-law's sister, and then the husbands who joined the women.
Yeah, so basically her in-laws and her aunt and uncle-in-law.
Right. And did Erin give them any reason for why she wanted to have them for lunch that day?
The court heard she didn't, that she just invited them at a mass at the local Baptist church a fortnight earlier. And she'd had Don and Gail Patterson over, I think a fortnight before that. And she said they had a good time. And at that lunch, Gail Patterson had remarked that, Heather would love to see this garden, you know, so Erin's told the court she wanted to invite Heather as well. That was the reason for them being there. Erin told the court that she didn't give them a reason for coming. She said, they loved me. I didn't need to give them a reason. I just invited them. She did invite Simon too, and she mentioned to him a medical issue that she wanted to discuss. But as far as we know, the other guests weren't told why she wanted them to come. The prosecution did use that as one of their arguments, that she lured them there with this false premise of a cancer diagnosis. But those 4 guests, well, there's only one standing, unfortunately, but Ian Wilkinson said, look, we only learned of the cancer diagnosis at the lunch.
So the lunch goes off seemingly without a hitch. There's a tour of a pantry because one of the women is very interested in pantries. Heather
had just done her pantry and wanted help knowing how to set it up. I think she wanted to look at everyone's pantries. So they did that before the lunch. They sat down. Heather is important because one of the curious things that she noticed at that lunch that she later told Simon Patterson was the plates. And the plates became a very big part of this trial, the plates that the beef Wellingtons were served on. So there were unique things about the meal that the beef Wellington wasn't done as a whole log, as the recipe says you should do. Erin did them in individual parcels, like pasties, and each had beef in it and a mushroom paste. And so that was one change to the recipe. Heather Wilkinson said to Simon Patterson when Simon picked them up when they were feeling sick, was Erin short on crockery? Because Heather and Gail took over 4 grey plates to the dinner table, and Erin took her own plate over, and that was said to be a different colour, like a tanny orange colour. So that formed a big part of the prosecution case, that Erin knew she'd poisoned them, she'd done it deliberately, and that different plate was how she distinguished her non-lethal meal from her guests.
And so and this is an important part that I think we sort of just brushed over, but I think we should reiterate it, is that there's the beef Wellington, which is this very fancy steak, and it's surrounded with a pastry, but between the pastry and the steak is a mushroom pate of sorts, right?
Yeah, they call it a duxelle. I'd never heard that word before. I'm not a very good cook, very busy journalist, but I learned a lot in this trial too. So a duxelle is basically a mushroom paste or pate, as you've said. Now, Erin told the court that she used button mushrooms but needed something a bit to add a bit more flavour, so she put in some dried mushrooms that she said she had in a Tupperware container in the pantry.
And we're going to get to her drying of the mushrooms in a minute, but the lunch, as I said, sort of goes off without a hitch. People go home. When does the sickness set in?
So the lunch guests started feeling sick around midnight or 1 a.m, and all of them did. Don and Gail, Heather and Ian, they all started suffering vomiting and diarrhea. And so I remember hearing the story about Ian and Heather Wilkinson that, they had to have a bathroom each. One was curled up outside the laundry. One had another bathroom because they were so ill. So that happened during the night. Don and Gail Patterson got an ambulance to hospital first thing in the morning around dawn and called their son Simon. Simon called Heather and Ian Wilkinson to check on them. They're like, we'll be fine, it's just gastro. And then he said, look, I really want you to go to hospital. Mum and Dad are in hospital. So he went over to pick up his aunt and uncle. And that's when he got there. That's when Heather said the thing about the plates. He said, Simon, was Erin short on crockery? I just noticed, is that why she served us on different colour plates? And Simon replied something like, I'm not sure. I don't think she has a lot. But that was something that clearly stuck in Heather's mind. So Simon drove Heather and Ian first to their local hospital, Corumburra, but because Don and Gail were there, beds were full, they couldn't take them, so he drove them on to Leongatha Hospital. And that was the morning of the Sunday, on the 30th of July.
I have to tell you, I don't think I've ever heard more discussion about poo than in your podcast.
Same. And the Bristol
There's a
stool
lot
chart.
of conversation. Yeah.
Same. I learned a lot there as well. Various consistencies, states of solid or liquid. Yeah, I hear you.
Yeah. But I mean, joking aside, and actually one of the things that I want to stop and tell people who haven't heard it, the reason I'm talking to you is that you and a couple of your colleagues at ABC covered this every single day of the trial. After the trial, you guys went back to your Airbnb and put this together. I mean, it was incredible amount of work, incredibly detailed. And one of the things that you did, you talked about sort of the levity in some of it, but it was terribly sad because these 4 somewhat elderly people become deadly, deadly ill. And 3 of them do lose their life in what I can't imagine is an easy way to go.
Horrific. So you've touched on 2 things there that I'd really like to talk about. In terms of the levity, we wanted to be your eyes and ears in the courtroom. And sometimes there was levity. And it's not like witnesses were making fun of the terrible situation, but I think it was a nice reminder that as human beings, we need a pressure release. You know, we need that gasket. A perfect example of this is Ian Wilkinson himself. You know, he's lost his best friend, Heather, his wife, and he was in the witness box giving evidence. And he had a chuckle a couple of times. And one was just this ridiculous scenario where his chair just started sinking down, like the gas in the chair. And it reminded me of, you know, when you do that pretend escalator where you hide behind. And it happened twice, and he had a little chuckle. And Justice Beale said, "Oh, don't worry, we do this to all our witnesses." And the whole room laughed. And it's just, you need a release because you're surrounded by so much pain and so much darkness and so much confusion. Why the hell, you know, if this was deliberate, would someone do this? So we did want to talk about those moments as well. But I did point out a lot in the podcast for people to remember that 3 people had died and 1 very nearly died, because I was seeing a lot of black humour in Australia and memes and things like that, like memes of a new Lego kit, you know, how to build a beef Wellington lunch, that I thought was inappropriate. So I just wanted to remind people that to them it's a story, but it's a nightmare for this poor guy who's in the witness box at the moment, Ian Wilkinson. And we had front row seats to all that pain because, as you said, we did go every day.
And what killed them was a full, complete shutdown of their organs. I mean, can you talk a little bit about what death cap mushrooms do to somebody?
Yeah, I didn't know much about this type of poison. It's called amanita poisoning. And amanita is the fatal toxin that's in death cap mushrooms. And Professor Warrilow from the Austin Hospital, which is where these 4 people ended up, he gave just this horrific breakdown of what it does to your body and how quickly. You know, initially it's gastroenteritis symptoms like vomiting and nausea, which they had. But he said the tricky thing with amanita poisoning is you get to a spot, I think like 3 or 4 days after, where you think you're getting better. You know, and I imagine this like the eye of the storm in a cyclone. You think, oh, I'm through it. And then after that, it's just this rapid and progressive plummet when your organs just start shutting off. It causes incredible damage to the liver because what it does, it recycles. This amanita toxin recycles in the body. Oh,
interesting.
So they were given charcoal tablets to try to stop the recycling. They were also given a drug called NAC. So it just horrific what it does to the body.
When do they realize that it was poisoning and that it was from the mushrooms?
Do you know what? This is the really interesting thing, Kathleen. Pretty soon on, which, as I said, you know, with this type of poisoning, people start to get or seem like they're a little bit better. And death cap poisoning is not something you'd usually jump to as a conclusion, you know, from a poisoned meal. You know, you'd be thinking about the beef, or I would. But very early on, I think it was Sunday night, Don and Gail Patterson had gone to Dandenong Hospital for better help. And one of the toxicologists there had a look and said, oh, I think the source might be death cap mushrooms, which is very quick to have that as a possibility. And then it was the next morning, the Monday morning, that a doctor at this hospital called Leongatha Hospital, where Ian and Heather were, and said, look, I think you need to start treating them for amanita poisoning. That's what we've started Don and Gail on. And so the 4 of them were then moved to the Austin. But pretty soon they started suspecting this as a cause, so like within a day. And that's why that led to the weird situation where Dr. Webster, Chris Webster at Leongatha Hospital, has got this call from Dandenong saying, move them to the Austin. We think it might be death cap poisoning. And so he's dealing with all that, trying to get them out. Ian and Heather have been woken from their beds early, raced down the corridor to ambulances. And it's when you juxtapose that with what Erin does, which arrive at Leongatha Hospital, Chris Webster says, you need to stay. We think you've had death cap mushrooms. And she says, oh, no, I didn't come prepared to stay. And she leaves. That's what made him so angry. And he called Triple O. He called police. to try to get her back, to say, look, this woman's just left. She needs to be treated. We think we think they all have death cap mushroom poisoning. And so in his mind, that's what made him suspicious about Erin Patterson.
Erin was never as sick as her guest, but she says she did have some gastro problems, right?
She did. She says that she started having diarrhea about 4 p.m. on the Saturday after the lunch. So 3 hours after the lunch. And the defense put up this reason as, maybe it came on earlier because the defense lawyer said she had been tasting the Duxelle in the morning, and that would be an explanation why it came on quicker than midnight for her other guests. Erin Patterson never said that in the witness box when she took the stand, which is something else we should talk about. But her defense lawyer mentioned that. Another reason given why she didn't get as sick is because in the witness box she said that she, and apologies, I should flag that we're going to be talking about disordered eating. She said that she has long had a problem with bulimia, and she said, look, I ate the rest of the orange cake. It was about 3/4 left, and then I purged it. So that might explain why she didn't get as sick, if that was true. But no doctors were called to give evidence on how quickly you would have to purge to get that toxin out of your system, if it's even possible, because Amanita is such a deadly toxin.
So Erin does all this suspicious stuff, and just to sort of timestamp or at this point, she's not really being looked at by the police as a suspect. I mean, they're still sort of just coping with the fact that people are getting ill. When does that shift? When do police start to look at her and start to really question what she says happened and that kind of stuff, and start to look at her like somebody who might have done this?
Sure. I'm not sure the exact date that she became a suspect, but they went to her house on the Saturday, so a week after the lunch, and they searched her house and they took various devices. They had an interview with her. They asked her to hand over her phone. Now, 2 suspicious things happened on this Saturday that they realised later. So for most of the year, she's been using what's called phone A. But while police are at her house, the SIM card in phone A disconnects from the network at around lunchtime. And then it reconnects to the network very early Sunday morning, 2 a.m., but in a different phone, in a different handset, a Nokia. And both phone A and the Nokia, and so presumably the SIM card, has never been found by police. So when police ask for her phone, she gives them what they called phone B, which was a dummy phone that hadn't really been used at all. The SIM in phone B had come from a tablet 3 days earlier, and so she'd never used it for calls even. And on this phone B, you'd remember there was a couple of resets done, and they were done to this phone, I suspect to clear whatever was on the SIM, which would have been in the tablet, which might have been photo caches and things like that. And Erin gave evidence to the court that I was worried those photographs might look suspicious. So that's why she says she did the reset. And then in the police interview, they asked her things like, are you a forager? And she said no. They asked, do you own a dehydrator? And she said no. And now you hinted at this earlier, the dehydrator formed part of the murder weapon because the prosecution alleged you picked these death cap mushrooms in April or May. They don't last very long. They last about a week. So you'd have to dehydrate them. The day the Crown says she picked them in Lock, that same day Erin bought a dehydrator.
Lock is a place, just to make it clear. Lock is a place.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a little town, tiny little town.
Okay.
In South Gippsland. And so the prosecution said, look, you went to Lock, you saw a post on this citizen science website of where death caps are growing. That same day, 10 days later, you've gone to this little town of Lock where someone posted death caps were. You've picked them, you've gone to buy a dehydrator, and you've started planning essentially a couple of months out from this lunch. Now, this dehydrator, they say, have you ever owned one? In the police interview, she says no. And they would have had to try hard to keep a straight face, I presume, because they'd found two things. They'd found a manual for the dehydrator in her drawer during the search. And on the Wednesday, so a few days before this interview, they had noticed on her bank statements a payment to the local tip. So they called the tip, they checked the CCTV.
And again, a tip.
Sorry.
In Australian is a garbage dump. That's okay, just because I know no one will know what that means. It's a garbage dump.
Sorry, guys. Yeah, a garbage dump.
That's great.
So they call the garbage dump worker and say, can you check your CCTV? He does. And there's a picture of Erin Patterson pulling up in her car and dumping something. And that something turned out to be the dehydrator.
So she's caught in all these lies, yeah.
Yeah, that was studied by scientists later, and they did find traces of alpha and beta amanita, the death cap toxin, in the dehydrator.
Erin Patterson has maintained, or did maintain through her trial, her innocence. So what does she say happened?
She said it was an accident. I didn't hear enough from her about how that accident happened. So we heard a lot from the prosecution, posts on iNaturalist. Yes, there's no evidence that she saw those posts, because if she saw them, they might have been on phone A, and phone A has disappeared. But the prosecution's argument was, you saw these posts, you went to two places, Locke and another little town called Outram. You picked these mushrooms, you dehydrated them, you put them in that Tupperware container, and you used them deliberately, knowing that it would kill these people. Erin Patterson's story was that it was an accident, that she has foraged since COVID. Lots of people started foraging during that time because we were going out of our minds with boredom, and that it became a thing, and that she liked mushrooms, she'd pick them, she'd post photos of her dehydrating mushrooms to a chat group she was in on Facebook, a true crime chat group, nonetheless. So that came up too, like, why the hell would you post photos of a murder weapon to very scrupulous women, part of a true crime chat group? But yeah, she argued, look, it was an accident. I must have put them with dried mushrooms in a Tupperware container like other dried mushrooms and forgot about it. And so when I went to this lunch to add some flavour to the meal, I've accidentally added forage mushrooms with the dried mushrooms, with the button mushrooms, and that's what's happened. But we never really found out, like, where she picked them from. The defence never asked her. So the jury kind of had to make a little mental leaps during this trial. And I said during the podcast, the intent bar is really high to prove in Australian law. I'm guessing it is over there as well. And I thought, I wonder if it'll be tricky for 12 people to clear this bar of intent beyond reasonable doubt when there are so many mental leaps they're going to have to make, and when there's no motive. Now, in Australia, we don't need a motive to prove murder. It's not one of the four elements of murder. But intent, the intention to kill, is an element, and often motive informs intent. Mm-hmm. And so without motive, I thought, I wonder if the jury is going to struggle with that. But I think during the trial, what I was seeing was the gaps that I thought might cause problems, that the jury is like, oh, I can't get there, so I might have to say not guilty. I think in their mind, the gaps were just huge gaps of suspicion. And then when she took the witness stand and she did try to fill in some of these gaps, you know, like the purging, the dehydrator, she said, look, I panicked. I was worried I might lose my kids. You know, I wonder whether they're like, she seemed to have an answer for everything, and whether they were suspicious of that. Now, we never know. We can't interview jurors in Australia. It's just not allowed. It's a crime. They can never talk. So we will never know what went on in that room. But I suspect the stories that she had for everything were too convenient. And it's interesting, at the start of the trial, I thought, yeah, I understand the dehydrator. Maybe I would do that. You know, I've covered a lot of court cases, And people do weird things when they're panicked. We just, our behaviour changes. Sometimes we can't control it. So I kind of thought, yeah, I understand that. If an ex of mine had accused me of killing his parents, I get that. I'd probably dump it too, even if I didn't do it. But then during the trial, I realised how many things I was trying to rationalise away. So that the cat's a lie, the phones, and each of these components on their own, you can explain away. But when you kind of stand back and look at the sum of all the parts, it does look suspicious. And I think that's where the jury landed.
I know you said you don't need to prove motive. Fine. Did motive in any way come clear to you? Is there any sense of why she did this?
No. And that will bug me forever. No more so than Ian Wilkinson and Simon Patterson, I presume. I don't know whether they'll ever find out why. The only hint or sniff at a motive that the prosecution tried to put up was a kind of dispute that Erin was having at the end of 2022 with her estranged husband, Simon, about child support payments. And she asked John and Gail Patterson to moderate that, and they were uncomfortable, and they're like, no, we don't want to get in the middle. We'll pray for you. And that sparked some messages with her Facebook group, who are these people, no self-awareness, I'm sick of them, who needs them, that kind of thing. And so, But that tiff with in-laws that she'd otherwise loved, and she didn't have her own mother had passed away, but I'm not sure the relationship she had with her mum was that good. We learned that her mum didn't come to her wedding because she was on a holiday on a train in Russia. So she did see John and Gail as parents. So that really messed with my head because I couldn't understand why you would deliberately want to kill people that, by all accounts, you loved and that your children loved. And there's no doubt she loves her children, so I didn't think she'd want them to be without their grandparents. Yeah, it's really tricky. I'll never understand, but maybe there's nothing to understand because we're applying a logical brain to this. And
yeah. She was a troubled lady, though, right? I mean, you had evidence that didn't go into the trial, but you spoke about it after, that like people who worked with her, she was an air traffic controller, so she was bright and capable, but people spoke about her being a liar even early on in her. So she seemed to be a troubled person. I mean, clearly she was found guilty of murder. She's troubled, but the trouble showed up in her earlier life.
Yeah, I didn't interview these people myself, so I'll give that a disclaimer, but colleagues of mine interview people from Air Services Australia. She worked as an air traffic controller. You do need to be extremely smart to get that job. And they were telling stories of her being manipulative, a liar, difficult. And one told a story that I had heard of before the trial, that she'd often prank her colleagues and she'd call up pretending to be them and say she was sick. And so their shifts would be cancelled. So she would come in and then they would rock up and their supervisor would be like, why are you here? I thought you were sick. And then one of them said she'd be giggling in the background. So I don't know whether that was a prank or someone said she did it to get more lucrative shifts. I don't know. But, yeah, not many colleagues that my colleague interviewed had favourable stories.
What was she actually found guilty of? Do you have first-degree murder there? Is that because they found intent?
She was found guilty of 3 counts of murder for Don Gail Patterson and Heather Wilkinson, and 1 count of attempted murder for Ian Wilkinson.
With all the work that you've done, can you tell me the impact? Like, was this one different? Why was it so popular out there? But also just in terms of the work that you've done, like, how do you feel about what those weeks at that trial did to you? Like, what did you think of it all?
It was hard to be, like I said earlier, sitting in that much pain for so long, because the Patterson and Wilkinson families were there most days. Ian Wilkinson was pretty much there every day. So we had a reminder daily what the toll was. So that was hard. And I know motive, it's not an element of murder, but my brain was trying to find something to cling to as to why someone would do this. And then at the end, I think, well, there's no good reason for murder in my brain. So any explanation is never going to be enough for them, for me or for them. So that's frustrating. And I think that's why people get interested in true crime generally, because of this curiosity and this need for answers. And very often, as in life, there isn't answers and we can't tie things up neatly with a bow. Yeah, but the struggle in my mind, I think people initially wanted it to be an accident because it's such a horrific thing and it defies historically what women are or are supposed to be: nurturers, feeders, carers. I think that a lot of elements of this case, I think, led to it being so sensational here and overseas, and it was that she's a woman. I'm not sure it would have got the same attention if it was a man, for the reasons I've just given. A lot of elements reminded me of the Lindy Chamberlain trial, like when she first gave an interview to the media, the way Erin Patterson was crying or not crying, people said, oh, that was crocodile tears. And I don't know, it wouldn't have been as popular over there, but the case of Lindy Chamberlain, she was accused of murdering her daughter Azaria. And then eventually, years later, a jacket of the... and that led to the whole pop culture thing in Australia, and equally...
That was the Dingo Ate My Baby
bad memes,
line
yeah,
with Meryl
Dingo
Streep.
Ate My Baby.
Yeah. With Meryl Streep played her in a movie, correct?
That's right. And interestingly,
Yeah.
I went to a talk that Lindy Chamberlain gave a couple of years ago at the State Library, and she said 33% of Australians still think she's guilty.
Yeah.
So that's a third of Australians. So she was found not guilty. But at the time, so much focus on her walking in and out of the court. She's not crying and she looks really stoic and she must have done it. There was a lot about Erin Patterson, the commentary around that reminded me of Lindy Chamberlain. Kathleen Goldhar was the same. She was a woman in Australia convicted of murdering 4 of her children. And then it took 20 years for science to catch up. And scientists discovered a gene mutation in 2 of her children, and that meant that it was a scientific reason for their death. And then the whole thing then toppled like Skittles, because prosecution case was, 1's an accident, 2 suspicious, 3 or more must be murder. So if you take out 2, the rest of the case crumbles. And people did the same thing for her. She was very, stony-faced and stoic going into court. So, sorry, I've got on a bit of a tangent there, but I think the ingredients of this case, Erin being a woman, it defies the historical gender roles, literally the ingredients itself, like mushrooms being a murder weapon. That's very Agatha Christie-esque.
Yeah.
The town that it was set in, this tiny little town in regional Australia. I said to my colleagues, I've done other big investigations that I've spent a year on. So I did a podcast, which was the first true crime podcast for the ABC, called Trace. And I looked at the cold case of Maria James. She was a woman murdered in 1980. And I asked her sons if they'd mind if I dig into it a little bit. And that ended up sparking a new coronial inquest for her, which is I'm incredibly proud of. But that took me, 2 years. The next Trace I did took, I think, another 2 years. And I'm incredibly proud of that work. And that took so long. And then this was a very different prospect, that we'd be in court every day. We'd leave court. We'd talk in the car about how the podcast was going to be structured. We'd walk into the recording studio, which we'd fit out the 3rd bedroom of an Airbnb as our studio, and we'd start talking. And it was so popular that I don't know whether I was I don't know whether to be frustrated about this or proud, because, compared to what I usually do, it was so fast, Still, we'd made sure about accuracy and obviously integrity. That's my number one priority. That's why I kept mentioning that people to remember that 3 people have died, but it's so fast compared to my normal work. So that was a big difference for me. But the other really touching thing that came out of that is I was seeing in real time how our work was affecting people. So usually with most journos, our work just goes into the abyss. You might have some nice emails, you might have some trolls. But this one, I think we're up to 8,300 and something emails from people thanking us for their podcast.
Wow.
Questions about the legal system. So Christian Silver, who's the court reporter at the ABC, this was his idea because he said, I get a lot of questions about, oh, my God, how did they land on that verdict, the jury, or why did the judge give that sentence? It's too light. And he said there's real big gaps in people's knowledge, unawareness of the legal system, and he wanted to lift the veil on the system and show the mechanics behind it. And so the questions we were getting were like, what is onus of proof? What's circumstantial evidence? Through to things like, can you tell me what the jury had for lunch? And the number of people that wrote in with questions about the system, I found really touching. And I thought, oh, I found my people, like other legal nerds that are really interested in this. And we were able to give them that. And so that in real time, seeing how our work was affecting people and helping people through to things that I never could have foreseen, Kathleen. Like I've got a couple of really, two that made me cry. One in particular, a man who was listening when his wife was going through breast cancer treatment and then she ended up passing away. And he said, thanks to you guys, because you were my constant, you were my escape during those days and something that I could just flee to and not think about the things that I was dealing with. And I bawled when I read that email because I had no idea that a true crime podcast would give people company like that.
It's nice, too, because in this world of all the crap we're facing as journalists and the news, to have immediate response that people are appreciating it, believing you, first and foremost, seeing the integrity and then engaging is really nice.
Yeah.
It's a very encouraging sign.
It's been the best part of it for me, actually.
Rachael, thanks again. It's been lovely to talk to you.
Thanks, Kathleen.
And now we have an update. About a week after I spoke with Rachael, Aaron Patterson was sentenced to life in prison. You've been listening to Crime Story from CBC Podcasts. You can hear the show ad-free by subscribing to CBC True Crime on Apple Podcasts. Be sure to follow us there on Apple or on Spotify. You can also find us on YouTube, where we release video episodes every week. Just search and subscribe to CBC True Crime. The show is hosted by me, Kathleen Goldhar. Our producers are Nikki Manfredi and Hadil Abdelnabi. Sound design and video production by Julian Uzieli, Reza Daya, and Evan Agard. Our digital producer is Emily Cannell, and our YouTube producer is John Lee. Our senior producer is Kate Evans. Executive producers are Cecil Fernandez and Chris Oak. Tanya Springer is the senior manager of CBC Podcasts, and Arif Noorani is the director.